During the time of slavery, black people lived under brutal conditions, but Django, an enslaved man, rode a horse and wore formal clothes. He was bought by a bounty hunter named Dr. King Schultz because he could identify 3 outlaws with bounties on their heads. Schultz didn't treat Django as a slave. He even took him to a bar. The bartender was shocked to see a black man there, so he ran to get the sheriff. Schultz and Django waited calmly. When the sheriff arrived, Schultz shot him, surprising everyone around. Later, it turned out that the sheriff was a wanted criminal worth $200. With this bounty, Schultz and Django teamed up. Django's role was to identify the 3 Brittle brothers, so Schultz could kill them and claim the rewards. Once the task was done, Django would be free and earn a share of the bounty. Before they set off, Schultz had Django clean up and dress well for a role they were going to play together. Now dressed sharply, Django accompanied Schultz to a plantation. The townspeople were stunned to see a black man on horseback. Schultz met the plantation owner on the pretext of discussing business. While looking around, Django found the 3 Brittle brothers who had previously abused him and his wife. Enraged, Django picked up a gun and killed one brother, then took a whip and beat another, mirroring how they had abused him before. Afterward, he finished him off with a gunshot. Schultz arrived after hearing the gunfire, and Django explained that 2 of the brothers were dead, while the 3rd had tried to escape on horseback. Schultz, confirming the target with Django, took aim and shot the 3rd brother. As the plantation workers and residents gathered, Schultz calmly explained his actions and showed the bounty posters. This explanation got them released, but the plantation owner wasn't about to let them go so easily. That night, a group of men pursued Schultz and Django. Schultz, anticipating this, had filled a wagon with explosives. When the attackers drew near, he set off the bombs, causing chaos. As everyone scattered in fear, Schultz handed a gun to Django, letting him decide whether or not to kill the plantation owner. Django, fueled by his anger and his skill, took his shot, bringing an end to the man who had caused him so much suffering. Dr. King Schultz admired Django's skill and asked him if he'd like to work with him over the winter. If they succeeded in their missions, Schultz promised Django a share of the bounty, and that he would personally help Django rescue his wife. A partnership between a white man and a black man as bounty hunters was formed. On their first mission, Django hesitated because the target had his wife and son with him. To help Django focus, Schultz showed him the criminal's past crimes, which renewed Django's resolve. With Schultz's training, Django's marksmanship improved. As winter ended, Schultz brought up a plan to rescue Django's wife, Broomhilda, who had been sold to Calvin Candie's plantation, known as Candyland. Candie was a cruel man, whose favorite pastime was forcing enslaved black men to fight to the death. Schultz knew Candie wouldn't just sell Broomhilda, so he devised a plan. Pretending to be a rich German interested in purchasing a skilled fighting slave, Schultz offered a staggering $12,000. Candie was enticed by the amount and invited them to his plantation. Upon arriving, Candie's black butler, Stephen, saw Django on a horse and was visibly displeased. But when he tried to mock Django, Candie scolded Stephen and instructed him to prepare rooms for their guests. Schultz, claiming he preferred a German-speaking servant, requested Broomhilda be brought to his room that night. Candie agreed, and that evening, Schultz and Broomhilda finally met. Schultz quickly explained the situation in German, asking her to stay calm. At dinner the next day, Schultz, Django, and Broomhilda pretended not to know each other, but Stephen picked up on some suspicious glances between Django and Broomhilda. During dinner, Stephen deliberately showed Candie the scars on Broomhilda's back. Seeing Django's anger, Stephen confirmed his suspicions and informed Candie in private, saying they were here to rescue Django's wife, not to buy a fighter. Realizing he'd been tricked, Candie returned to the dinner, keeping calm but furious. To intimidate them, he placed a skull on the table and explained it belonged to an enslaved man who had served his family for years. While talking, Candie explained that when his father's personal slave shaved him, he had countless chances to kill him but couldn't. To illustrate his point, Candie sawed off a piece of the slave's skull, pointing out what he claimed were indentations that proved black people were naturally subservient. Schultz, horrified, had no choice but to play along. Candie then ordered his men to disarm Django and Schultz, and demanded $12,000 for Broomhilda, threatening to kill her with a hammer if they refused. Left with no choice, Schultz threw the money at him, and Candie signed a contract for Broomhilda's release. However, just as Schultz was about to leave, Candie insisted on a handshake to seal the deal, threatening to shoot if Schultz refused. Enraged, Schultz shot Candie instead. Django immediately grabbed a gun and finished off Candie's men. Django, an experienced bounty hunter by now, expertly took down any enemies in his path. But when his wife was held hostage, he was forced to surrender. Django was ultimately sold to a mining company, condemning him to a brutal life. On the journey, however, Django managed to convince a guard he was actually a bounty hunter, not a slave, and revealed that several criminals with high bounties were back at Candyland. Intrigued, the guards checked Django's wanted posters, and upon confirming his story, handed him a gun and freed him. Upon arrival, Django retrieved Broomhilda's release papers and bid farewell to Schultz's body. That night, as Candie's family and associates returned to Candyland after his funeral, Django lay in wait on the second floor. He ambushed and killed them all. However, Stephen, the butler, wasn't concerned, believing Django was out of bullets. He taunted Django and insulted him until Django set off an explosive fuse, leaving the building to watch from a distance as Candyland went up in flames. Finally, Django rode off on horseback with Broomhilda, setting out to find freedom together.